the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I'm your host, John Moorhead, and I hope you enjoy this podcast today. Of course, this is not the only subject matter we've covered. If you take a look at our growing library, you see a variety of multi-faith and religion and pop culture topics. And if you check out our website, at multifaithmatters.org, you'll find a variety of other resources, not only the podcast, but videos and recommended articles and recommended books and such things. So please seek that out. Today, I'm pleased on the podcast to have a guest that we've been trying for several weeks here, and we finally pulled it together. Fred Stella. I'm going to read Fred's bio here. Fred is a product of 16 years in the Catholic education system, including his time at the University of Detroit, where he obtained his degree in communications and mass media. His interest in Hinduism began at age 15 when studying comparative religions. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he formally embraced the Dharma. Over the years, Fred has spent time expanding his knowledge with study and practice in various ashrams and temples in the U.S. and India. In 2009, the West Michigan Hindu Temple ordained him as, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Fred, Pracharak? Pracharak. Was my second guess. Or outreach minister. Fred is often a featured speaker at international conferences and has completed extensive lecture tours in India and Guyana. One of Fred's passions is interfaith dialogue and cooperation. For the past 23 years, he has served as president of the Michigan organization, Interfaith Dialogue Association, an affiliate of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. In this capacity, he, among other things, hosts the program Common Threads, which airs over local Michigan NPR affiliate WGVU-FM. He is also a weekly contributor to the Grand Rapids press column Ethics and Religion Talk, where he and fellow clerics answer questions on theology, morality, and personal issues. In 2012, Fred was presented with his city's Champion of Diversity Award for his work in interfaith relations. Finally, Fred sits on the National Leadership Council of the Hindu American Foundation in Washington, D.C. Fred, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, John.
It's good to have you here. We've been trying for several weeks, but we finally pulled it off. I'm a little nervous about today's podcast, folks, because Fred, as you will be able to pick up, has a much better radio voice than I do. In fact, he does some work in voice acting, and we won't be talking about that, but I'm going to be envious as we go through the process here. So Fred, again, welcome. You know, I like to begin these conversations by kind of grounding some of these more abstract issues in people's lived experience. Let's begin by you sharing your story. How did you come to embrace Hinduism?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. And second, one thing we do have in common, even so, I do not like the sound of my recorded voice any better than anybody else.
Okay, all right.
So I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I'm an Italian American, and they don't give you a choice. If you're Italian American, you're pretty much you're going to be Catholic. And so I was a good Catholic. I mean, I really liked religion. You can tell by my report cards. Very young, I was very thick. I was not an intelligent kid at all. I was really rather stupid, if I may use a technical term. But if you look at my very average and below average grades, but you will see a B or an A in religion. And so that always fascinated me. And then, as you say, I took a world's religions class and started exploring Hindu Dharma. Keep in mind, I believe you mentioned this in the bio too, that it took me a really, really long time to go from exploring at the age of 15 to actually taking initiation in my particular expression of the Dharma. That wasn't until my mid 30s. I forget exactly, but it might have been around 34, 35, something like that. So it took a long time. It was a very thoughtful process.
It's interesting that you're a convert from another tradition. Do you have any kind of feel for Hindus in America? Is it mainly an immigrant faith? Are you starting to see more conversions from other traditions?
There are two tracks. There is what is called white Hinduism, and of course that's a misnomer because there are black and brown Hindus. But for simplicity's sake, people started calling people who were not Indian, of Indian descent, white Hindus. So what I will refer to them, us, simply as non-Indian. Um, but yeah, as I mentioned, there are two tracks. There is the track that has been cut by first generation Indian Americans, and also Indians, people of Indian descent from other countries. So, for instance, there's a significant Caribbean Indian population. So they're not from India, but their forebears were from India. But they're all on the same track. Immigrants who practice a very traditional, most likely ceremonial version of Hinduism. And then there are people such as myself who came in, and again, it's a different track because we don't embrace Indian culture as significantly as the others. And most of us came in interested in things like meditation, interested in the theology of Hinduism, the philosophy of Hinduism. And it is really interesting when folks like me dialogue with the people on the other track, because so many of them, and this is certainly true in any religion, Christianity included, you have a lot of people who grew up with it culturally. But if you grab, a typical Christian, not somebody like you, but somebody who has been a Christian all their lives, they may even go to church. If you ask them to explain the deep philosophical and theological points of Christianity, you might get some resistance.
Right.
And in Hinduism, because the culture and the religion are so intertwined, sometimes it's so difficult to separate the two. You have a lot of people who aren't, or at least originally weren't, as focused on the theology and the philosophy. It was the ceremony and it was the culture. So those are the significant differences. I try to bridge that because I'm a member of two communities here in Grand Rapids. As you mentioned, I'm the Pracharak, and I'm sorry, I try to remember to have that phonetically pronounced when I give people my
That's
bio.
what I get for not reading it through before we actually started recording. So,
And anyway, so most of the people in our congregation at the Hindu temple are of Indian, either they are Indian by birth and they're immigrants, or they're second or third generation, but they're Indian culturally, Indian American. And that's one. And then I have a strong affiliation and a leadership role in what we call a Sangha. It's a meditation group, and it is strongly rooted in the Hindu yoga tradition. And so if you go to the Hindu temple on any given day, especially if there's a ceremony or maybe a festival, you count the non-Indian faces and you come up with very, very few, maybe 1% or less. You come to our meditation group, it's the opposite, where it's primarily people of Euro-Anglo descent with a few Indian faces intermixed. So as I say, and if I may,
sure.
I refer to the temple-based Hinduism as Catholic Hinduism, and I refer to the more contemplative my other group as Protestant Hindu, simply because there is so much emphasis on ritual in the temple, and there is almost no ceremony in the meditation group. So,
Yeah, it's an interesting way of comparison there that might be helpful to listeners and viewers. My assumption in going into our conversation today is that those who are listening probably know very little other than perhaps some stereotypical things about Hinduism compared to other religious traditions that tend to be more on the radar. So to help with that, what are some of it might be a tall order here, but what are some of the prominent expressions of Hinduism in America, and what's its history? How did Hinduism arrive on American shores?
One of the most popular expressions in Hinduism is, "Thank you, come again." I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You had to go to The Simpsons, didn't you?
I did. I did. Um, okay, so when we say expressions of Hinduism, we're first of all, let's talk about the temples. So keep in mind, this is important. The migration pattern is so important to this story. We had, as you might know, very racist immigration laws. We had quotas for people from Asia, and people from Europe were let in at a much greater number up until 1965, when there was a Reformed Immigration Act. That's when the floodgates opened, and people from Asia and India in particular started coming into the United States. There were practically no temples in the United States, only in a handful of very large cities, and they were very small temples. Once they started coming in, they started building temples, and late 60s, early 70s really started to flourish. So Hinduism is a newcomer for the most part to the American scene, even though we did have Hindus in this country in the 19th century and probably the 18th century. We certainly had Hindu thought through the transcendentalists, because, as you might know, people like
Right.
Thoreau and Emerson were
Emerson, yeah.
really enamored with our scriptures. Um, and then you had this influx in the late 60s of Hindu teachers. And the Hindu teachers were the ones that often attracted non-Indians, because they were more focused in the philosophy. They were more focused in meditation, in hatha yoga. And that's something that might be interesting to some of the folks here. Yoga. Uh, First of all, yoga is much, much bigger than what most people think of. If I say, John, after this podcast, I'm going to go do yoga, um, you probably would think that I'm going to throw out a mat on the floor and I'm going to get into some interesting postures, which I might do. That is an expression of yoga, but I just might go to the food bank and help distribute goods to people affected by the pandemic. And that's yoga too. Yoga means union. And hatha yoga is the yoga of health and of contemplative movement, basically prayer in motion. And karma yoga is selfless service. And jnana yoga is studying the scriptures or listening to a teacher. And bhakti yoga is the yoga of devotion, trying to establish a personal relationship with the divine. So most people, when they think of yoga, only think of hatha yoga because that's the big Western expression. And it's interesting, there is a controversy, I'm sure you've heard of it. Can evangelical Christians or Christians of other stripes practice hatha yoga with a clear conscience?
Right.
Are they taking a walk on the wild side by doing that theologically? And you have thought leaders, ministers, clerics, etc., who are saying, you have to understand that yoga comes out of Hinduism, and that by practicing yoga, you are dipping your toe into the Hindu world. And you have a lot of people saying, no, 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 it's just exercise. Then you have Hindus agreeing with the ministers, saying, well, yeah, you're right. Um, but the way we look at it is, you don't have to be Hindu to practice yoga. You don't have to change your belief system at all. If all you want to do is tighten up the shoulders or become more flexible, that's fine. But we do appreciate people knowing that it is an expression of Hinduism. But you can take all of the Hinduism out of yoga in the same way that you can take all of the Christianity out of Christmas. Think about that. It's almost the same argument, if you will. How many people celebrate Christmas in a secular manner? Tons of people. And you have the Christian community saying, wait a minute, don't forget the Christian underpinnings. There's not even just underpinnings. It's a significant integral part of what it is to be Christian. But other people will just go, yeah, but I know, but I just like to have a tree and presents. So I often compare yoga / Hinduism with Christmas Christianity.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the controversy and that there's agreement and disagreement. We'll let folks weigh that controversy out. And if they want to get in touch, we can pass along some resources, but we're not here to settle that controversy today. Can you discuss some of the main elements of Hinduism? If you wanted a Christian to have just a basic understanding of what Hinduism about, what are some of the practices and beliefs that underlie that?
Sure. Be happy to oblige, and I'll do it as quickly as I can. I mean, there is a lot to unpack there, as you know.
Oh yeah.
So, and I'll do as much contrasting and comparing as I can through a Christian lens, and that is one of the benefits of 16 years of Catholic education is I feel I'm kind of bilingual.
Right. But at the same time, let me also say, don't feel a burden to have to do that. One of the concerns I have about Christian approaches, particularly evangelicals, to other religions, is we're stuck in this doctrinal comparative template. They believe this, we believe this, and therefore they're wrong. So draw contrast as it's helpful, but feel free to describe what your faith tradition is in its own right, and we'll do the
absolutely
homework. Yeah,
absolutely. But so, for instance, when someone asks about a religion, I mean, if a Martian came down and said, John, what's all this Christianity about? Where do you go first? I think that until you establish two things, it's hard to go anywhere else. And that is, what is your concept of divinity? And what is our relationship to that divinity, if there is a relationship to be had, if there's a divinity that exists? So I'll start from there. For the most part, the understanding of divinity, of God with a capital G, is that God, and God has many different names, but when we're talking about God in its most supreme essence, we use the term Brahman. And Brahman normally is, when we talk about Brahman, we don't even assign any sort of gender to it. You really shouldn't. Some people do, but you shouldn't say he or she. Brahman is it. Brahman is pure absolute consciousness. Brahman is impersonal and yet has a personal aspect. And the biggest difference between all the Abrahamic religions and the Dharmic religions, including Hinduism, is that the Abrahamic religions believe that God created the universe as an other thing. There's God, and then there's everything that he created. Mm-hmm. Hindus would say that God didn't create the universe as much as God became the universe. The universe is an expression of divinity. It is not the totality of divinity. So if the entire universe or the multiverses all imploded into nothingness, there would still be Brahman. There would still be God. Okay. So another thing to compare would be to say a Christian would say God is in this room. A Hindu would say God is this room. God permeates the atoms, the protons and the electrons. It's all God stuff. So what that means is that we are a part of divinity. We have always been a part of divinity. and there will never be any separation of divinity from divinity. So whatever it is that we do, whatever route our lives take, and in the afterlife state as well, we are always a part of the divine. So what that means then is there is no, let me turn that into a positive. The end result of every soul that has ever been expressed out of God, the end result is always to return to that divine source. That doesn't go just for Hindus. If you are an embodied being, that is your destiny. So it's kind of a Hindu predestination, if you
Okay.
will. That now in our individual lives, because I know Christians love talking about free will. So the question comes up: Do Hindus believe in free will? Microcosmically, yes. Macrocosmically, no. So in our individual lives, we have choice, and we can move towards God. We can move in a completely other different direction. I could drop everything now and just dive into a life of pure hedonism and nastiness, if that's where I felt I would find the most happiness. And life after lifetime, because we do talk about rebirth, and we might get into that a little bit later, but life after life, I will be given every opportunity to come back to that divine source. And at some point, again, the predestined part of this is that I'll get just a big clunk on the head, and I will realize at some point, all this isn't really making me happy. The money isn't making me happy. The pleasures aren't making me happy, and I will discover the joy of leading a God-centered life. And again, that God-centered life doesn't have to be a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Christian. Uh, uh, Hinduism does not confer upon its members any special election. God doesn't like us any better. And anyone of any religion or no religion can acquire that state of self-realization, awakenedness, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, we no longer need to reincarnate. We merge into the bosom of the divine. So I'll stop there for now, because I think that is the most important element of Hinduism is, what is the divine and our relationship to it.
Yeah, I just hopefully listeners will understand that an hour podcast is not enough to adequately unpack any religious tradition, including Hinduism. And so all we're able to do is kind of hit some highlights, and hopefully that will generate some understanding, and folks can seek out appropriate resources to, including conversations with other Hindus in their neighborhoods,
Yes.
to try
And
and.
I can share. I'll tell you too, if people go to hinduamerican.org, which is my organization in Washington, D.C., if they poke around a little bit, they will see Hinduism 101. Click on that link, and you'll walk away very informed.
Awesome. I will include that link to that organization and that document in the program notes as well,
Oh,
so
great.
that folks can find that. So when we, as Christians, particularly evangelicals and Protestants, think about religion, we tend to think of text-based religions. But not every religion is text-based, even though they may have a text. Hinduism has sacred texts. What is the relationship between Hinduism and their sacred texts and the Vedas? How does that come together?
I have a feeling I'm not going to answer that question to your satisfaction or mine,
Okay.
but
All
I will
right.
give it a stab. So you are correct. We do have texts, plural. And here's the best thing that I can do. And again, I'm going to compare. I want you to imagine a world where nobody ever got the bright idea to take those 66 books that make up your Bible and scrunch them together into one volume. So you just have all these different scripts out there. Job, Genesis, Mark, Luke, and certain people. Imagine certain people gravitating towards some books as opposed to others. So you might have your John Christians and your Mark Christians and your Matthew Christians. Okay. Not that they're locking horns all the time. It's just, okay, you come from the tradition of Mark, you come from the tradition of John. That's just fine. You might emphasize certain things in your life more than somebody else. That is a very simplistic understanding of what Hinduism is. We have tons and tons of text. I'm constantly coming up. I'm doing some reading, and all of a sudden I'll read that this comes from the such and such book, and thousands of years old. I'd never heard of it. And that's okay. Now, we do have 4 foundational books. They're called the Vedas. And I would say the Vedas would be kind of like our Torah in that everything proceeds from them. They are foundational. But these other books can be more important to me. For instance, the Bhagavad Gita, which I know you've heard of, and I'm sure many others have. The Bhagavad Gita, to me, is more important than the Vedas. It just is. And what I need to know is in the Bhagavad Gita. I do study the Vedas to some degree, but not anywhere near the extent that I focus on the Bhagavad Gita. Other people, they focus on the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Shiva Puranas. There's just a lot. And so perhaps that is why we are not considered a religion of the book. And also our teaching tradition allows us, I believe, a bit more latitude. So for instance, imagine the Christians today who are very concerned about, say, the role of women in the church. What can women do? Are they able to be ministers, etc.? Or the LGBT issues. You go back to the texts, and how you interpret them means this is what I have to abide by. And sometimes people are frustrated in that. Hindus, I think, are a lot more comfortable with, oh, that's then, this is now. Okay. I read something in the Vedas, I think it was just yesterday, and it was a verse that said something like, the two of you shall come together, meaning a husband and wife, yada, 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 and pray for a male child. Well, 5,000-6,000 years ago, maybe having male children was a little bit more valuable, but I would say that the vast majority of my Hindu co-religionists would say, no, we don't do that. Maybe after 4 daughters, they might say that prayer if they really want some diversity in their home, but that stuff just isn't important. So I think we have some permission to just say, well, that just doesn't speak to the way society is these days, so I'm going to ignore that. Of course, you have to be very judicious about that. You can't go around robbing banks because you've just decided that the prohibitions against stealing don't mean anything to you anymore.
Right. I always try and send the questions ahead of time to my conversation partners just so they can kind of know the line of questioning and prepare answers. But one has come to mind, and that is how have prominent spokespersons or personalities within American pop culture been helpful or perhaps a hindrance to Hinduism? I'm thinking here of like Yogananda, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi of transcendental meditation, Deepak
Hmm.
Chopra. How has that helped Hinduism in American culture, and maybe not?
That's a good question. I'm happy to address it. For the most part, it has been helpful. However, one of the challenges that I see, it frustrates me a great deal, when these movements attract celebrities and the teacher becomes a celebrity, and then it's all about the celebrity, right? It's star power.
Hmm.
To me, that uh, is never a good sign. And I certainly, if we were to talk about people in the Christian world who become rock stars, you know that can be very
Oh
dangerous
yeah.
on a number of levels. So I feel the same way. Now, interestingly, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but it was one of the things that led me to where I am today was when the Beatles went to India to study with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Um, I wasn't personally attracted to him, but something clicked. And when they did that, I was 12, I think 11, 12, when they went to India. And so I was still Catholic, but it's something about the process of meditation really appealed to me back then. And I just kind of put it in the back of my mind. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And it wasn't like, oh, the Beatles are doing it, so it has to be good, because a year before, the controversy was the Beatles were admitting publicly that they were taking LSD.
Hmm.
And my 11-year-old self didn't go, oh, well, I got to go take LSD if the Beatles are doing it. No, not at all. I was actually very disappointed in that they were involved in drugs. But when they got into meditation, interestingly enough, through a Hindu expression, I was it fascinated me. That said, again, the Maharishi started collecting celebrities, and that bothered me. And it continues whenever I see some sort of movement, whether it's Hindu or something else, and they focus on the some celebrity. I'll tell you what too. There was a World Hindu Congress outside of Chicago going on 3 years ago now. And the leadership asked me if I could get Julia Roberts to give a speech, because my wife and I are connected somewhat. We're nowhere near the level of Julia Roberts. Okay, we don't hang together, but they had this unrealistic expectation that I could just call Hollywood. Hey, Julia, babe, how you doing? And just the thought, like, of all of the wonderful people that could give talks, why an actress? Why somebody from Hollywood? It didn't happen, by the way. Julia wasn't taking my calls.
Well, I'm disappointed, but maybe in the future, who knows?
Yeah.
What are some of the stereotypes that you run into that Christians have about Hindus and Hinduism?
Well, that's interesting, because the latest polls say that uh, most Christians have no idea
Hmm.
of Hinduism. It's a very neutral, when you see what religions Christians are aware of, and how they feel about them.
Mm-hmm.
We're like the 50% mark. Like, we don't know too much about it. The people who do uh, uh, know about us, first of all, you have to be Indian to be Hindu. That's something that a lot of people they look askew, like, really. Right? But yeah, there's no prohibition in the scriptures or any tradition that you have to be a certain ethnicity. And I've been multiple places in India, at ashrams and temples. I did a lot of public speaking. Nobody's ever come up to me and said, "Who do you think you are?"
Mm-hmm.
What you non-Hindu you? No, that's not true. Um, um, and another thing is the idea of polytheism. The problem with Hinduism from a Western standpoint is we don't neatly fit into one of those isms when it comes to the understanding of divinity. So here's how I would explain that. So we have God with a capital G, and we do have entities that we refer to as gods and goddesses with a lowercase g. Different Hindus have different understandings of exactly what that means. To some people, the gods and goddesses are real supernatural entities that exist in a spiritual realm and can have an influence on how we live our lives. Other Hindus don't believe that they necessarily have an objective existence, but are more like archetypes. They are expressions of the various aspects of divinity, but they've been personified to teach us lessons on morality, ethics, and theology. So you can have two people at a Hindu temple, both of them sitting in front of a statue of Ganesh or Shiva or whatever deity, one understanding that this entity actually exists in the great beyond, and another one having that understanding. Shiva is just a personification of the power of God for regeneration. And both of them exist very well together. Um, so to call it polytheism, just to say Hinduism is pure polytheism, is wrong. But I can't say that there isn't a polytheistic element in Hinduism, because we do have these entities, real or imagined. And you walk into a Hindu temple and you see all of these statues, and you see people bowing to them or sitting in front of them, meditating and praying. At first glance, you're just going to think, well, it's a polytheistic religion, but it's much greater than that. Ultimately, everything rests in Brahman, in the same way that I rest in Brahman, and I believe you rest in Brahman. If there is a Shiva or a Vishnu, etc., they would rest in Brahman too. So ultimately, there still is that one source. So that's significant. And the other thing is too, and this is a really tough issue. We'd have to do a whole show on this, and if we did, I'd even get somebody even better equipped to have this discussion. But the whole idea of the caste system is really a challenge. So here's the best I can do on caste, if I have just a couple of minutes to say this. There is no question that the Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, talk about society and the division of labor. And it is divided in four ways: the intellectuals, physicians, and religious people at the top, the government, whether it's a monarch or a soldier, in second, third, the mercantile community, business, and fourth, labor. Now, in the scriptures, I can show you several examples where it states that this is not birth-based, that you can't call yourself a Brahmin just because your daddy was a Brahmin. However, that system did get corrupted. I know, corruption in religion. John, have you ever heard of that?
What a surprise.
I
It's
know.
in a sense, it's nice to hear that it's not just a Christian problem.
So I never heard about that. You'll have to tell me about it sometime. So anyway, there was, you could be born into a family of Sudras, which are the laborers, and you could end up a Brahmin. What people fail to realize is some of the greatest religious figures in Hinduism do not are not from the Brahmin class. They're from lower classes, including the Sudra class. And this whole idea of untouchable, which is a great stain on Indian society, there is no basis for that whatsoever. There is no scriptural basis or teaching basis. And what I say about it is, about caste in general, is that like with slavery, where the vast majority of slave owners in the United States were Christian, the vast majority of abolitionists were Christian. And so there is a significant tension. There's a significant work going on in Indian societies between the people who still hold on to the past and people who realize that this is wrong. Caste. There's nothing in the scriptures. Actually, the opposite is in the scriptures. Any sort of bigotry, to look down upon someone. Now, what caste does do, it acknowledges that there is a natural hierarchy. And in every society, there's no pure egalitarian society, because I don't believe that's how we're built. And so I often pose this example. If I was to tell you, John, I know the son of a plumber who grew up to be bank president, you might say, well, that's very nice, but this is America, and that happens. If I was to tell you that the son of a plumber goes into his father's business and maintains his plumbing identity, and he marries the daughter of a bank president, that doesn't happen very often. And so sociologists acknowledge that if you share the same socioeconomic status, the same more or less education status, religion, things like that, you're going to have a more successful marriage. A lot of caste issues delve or revolve around that familiarity with social connections. And one other thing too, one of the things that really made caste the problem it has been is British colonialism, because they encouraged caste division, and they were very hard and fast on scheduling who's in this caste and who's in this other caste. I don't want to blame everything on colonialism, because that's a kind of an easy thing to do, but it didn't help matters.
Sure.
So there you go.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I would encourage Christian viewers and listeners to try and be more aware of the stereotypes that we have, and to check those by again going deeper and having those important conversations, and looking not primarily at Christian books necessarily about Hinduism, but look at what Hindus are writing, and trying to unpack all of that. Some of what you just said folds over nicely into my next question. I try to be self-critical about my own Christian tradition. I think it's important, particularly in light of what's going on in the American context. And I think you are similarly wired from some of what I just heard about wanting to, be critical about your own tradition. We've seen a revival of various forms of nationalism in America and other places, including India. What are your thoughts as an American Hindu about some of what has gone on in India with nationalism?
First of all, since I am, as you rightly described me, an American, my understanding of Indian politics my understandings are better than those of the average bear. But I still am an American who is focusing mainly on what we have here. What I can say is this: it's all very complicated, and each issue, I take each issue individually, and I look at it, and I make my own decisions. And sometimes I agree with the premise, but not necessarily the method. And I'll give you an example. For instance, about the abrogation, what is called the abrogation of Article 370, where Kashmir changed its status.
Right.
So for everyone who doesn't know about that, Kashmir had a special status that was given temporarily. In the Constitution, it says this is temporary and can be revoked at any time. It allowed them more autonomy than other Indian states. So it's kind of like how we treat Texas, you know. I mean, imagine Texas on steroids, where they really could do things. So imagine a state that we still allowed slavery in, something like that. So, Kashmir had its own government. It was still a part of India, but at the same time, as I say, separate. And the Indian government finally decided, you know what, we want Kashmir to abide by Indian law, which meant that, for instance, because Kashmir is primarily Muslim, and there you could legally divorce your wife by what is called triple talaq, by simply saying, I divorce you 3 times. And they also wanted to offer the same protections to the LGBT community, which they did not have there. And they just wanted it to be part of the family. Now, the methods that they used were somewhat draconian because they were afraid of terrorist attacks. So they came down heavy, and it wouldn't surprise me at all. It doesn't surprise me at all that there are charges of human rights abuses. I condemn human rights abuses. Absolutely. I condemn violence towards people. At the same time, throughout all of this conversation that I've read and heard in Western media, very few people remember that in 1990, Hindus were driven out of the Kashmir Valley, hundreds of thousands of them, in a cultural genocide by Pakistan-backed terrorists, where these Islamists rode through towns, and the phrase was flee, convert, or die. People forget about that. And they're trying to resettle these people who lost their land. So once again, I support Kashmir I support the new status of them being a full-fledged union territory under the Indian government, as was hoped for way back when. I strongly condemn any human rights abuses and any violence, period. Um, and here's one of the issues in India that a lot of people aren't aware of. So India is a secular state. They don't have a state religion, as does Pakistan. The problem is they express their secularity in a different way than we do. They take religion much more seriously than we do. And when India got their independence, they gave special rights to minority religions. So, for instance, Islam being a minority religion, they subsidized Muslims' pilgrimages, their Hajj, to Saudi Arabia. Another thing was that Christians, Jews, Muslims, etc., all have control of their houses of worship. Right? Doesn't that make sense to you? That if you walk into a mosque in your town, wouldn't you guess that it's run by some sort of board, and they're all Muslim, and they're all stakeholders? Guess
Right.
who runs? Yeah, guess who runs the temples in India? The government.
Hmm.
So again, this is a wacky form of secularity, and so because of that, that caused a tremendous amount of tensions. Here's something, John. You had Hindu organizations, Hindu temples and organizations trying to convince the government that they weren't really Hindu, so they would get the perks that minority religions were getting.
Hmm.
Seriously, yeah,
Wow.
they would go and say, "Oh, no, we're not Hindu." They try to cite one particular verse, and they go, "Well, see, we don't do that, so we're not Hindu." And the government basically said, "Get out of here! You guys are Hindu." um, so uh, to wrap things up, again, one more time, because it is so very important. A lot of these issues are very complicated. The farmer issue, you know that there's a
Right.
big farmer
Mhm.
protest. What people don't know is that, number one, there are 26 Indian states, 23 states, the farmers of 23 states support what the government is going to do. This whole protest is from farmers in 3 states. And this is not a religious issue, but people are trying to religionize it. So believe me, this is an economics issue, and economics to me is like religion, meaning that you have faith in something, but you can't guarantee the outcome of that faith. And so, if the government does A, B, C, and D financially, is it going to be good for the country? Is it going to be bad for the country? We all have our positions, and then we find out later. Oh, did it cause inflation? Oh, did it cause a recession? Oh, did it cause a depression? Oh, did it cause prosperity? You don't know until it's happening. So, in terms of what the government is promoting in their farming legislation, I'm not the guy to ask. only that I support peaceful protest, and I support a government allowing protest without causing any fear of loss of life or rights.
I appreciate your willingness to weigh in on that. I know that you don't speak for all Hindus in America, or let alone
Mm-mm.
India. And
No. I do. They gave me permission.
yes, yes. Well, I'm going to go on record and say I don't speak for all Christians, but I do try and represent the
No,
evangelical.
I don't speak for all.
I know,
Oh
I
my
know.
gosh, no.
But I do appreciate them. These are difficult times that we live in, and I just think that people in various religious traditions need to be informed about what's going on, draw upon a wide variety of sources, and recognize that there are a wide variety of forces that are playing into how we interact with each other, and we need to be on guard against, like you say, violence and human rights violations and those kinds of things. So I
Yes.
appreciate your willingness to weigh in on that. Let's conclude our time together with talking a little bit about dialogue. How have Hindus been involved in interreligious dialogue?
That is a good question, and I'll tell you this. First of all, remember I talked about, pulling your average Christian off the street and saying, "Hey, we need you to present to a group tonight on Christianity." How many people would be going like, "Hamana, oh,
Right, right, right. No way.
yeah, okay." So many Hindus that I have come across are so reluctant to be involved in dialogue
Mhm.
because it means they have to speak intelligently
Mm.
about their tradition, especially when they're in the same room. I know that dialogue, that sometimes it takes place with a group of clerics, and sometimes it takes place with a group of lay people, and sometimes it's a mix of the two. So when you get a garden variety Hindu dialoguing with a John Moorhead, then they're overwhelmed at your knowledge of your religion, and they feel like pipsqueaks because they don't have the training. So there's that. So I have been actively seeking more Hindus here in West Michigan to become involved in dialogue, and sometimes it's been a challenge. I'll be quite honest with you. The two most active Hindus in dialogue outside of myself are 2 brothers. Uh, one's in 7th grade, and the other one is a sophomore in high school. And these kids are superstars. They know their religion better than so many adults. They've been trained very, very well. So when I can't do something, I try to get them to do it. And the other thing is, I will admit that we've kind of had to come to the interfaith, multi-faith table and kind of scrunch ourselves in between, because so much of dialogue, the history of dialogue in the United States, it first started out, of course, interdenominationally, then it was Christian Jewish, and then Christian Jewish Muslim. So you had
Mhm.
all the Abrahamics together, and then all of a sudden you got these people going, hey, we want in too, and
Right.
we come in with this totally different tradition because we don't descend from Abraham. We don't have similar scriptures, right? What you share, the Judeo-Christian tradition with the Bible and the Quran, basically, coming out of the Bible, so many of the same figures. It was difficult in the beginning. More and more, you are going to find acceptance that people have opened up their circle and allowed us in, and that has been a blessing. Here in Grand Rapids, since I've been working in interfaith for over 20 years, um, it's very natural for the most part. If somebody is doing something interfaith and they're going, well, hey, we need this, we need that. Oh yeah, we need a Hindu. So I get, there's not too many forums or events where I'm left out. Okay, or I should say that the tradition is left out. I will tell you one story. One time, this high school called me up, local, and they said, we're having diversity day, and of course one way of expressing diversity is through religion, and we're putting together a panel. Now, aside from me speaking, my role as president of Interfaith Dialogue Association, I run the speakers bureau. So people will call me for speakers. Instead of, like, if you want a Muslim speaker, instead of calling the mosque, they'll call me, and I'll get in touch with the right people at the mosque, or mosques, plural. We have several here. And so that's what we do. So like we're your one-stop shop for all your spirituality needs. You don't have to call all these different places. Leave it to us. So I said, well, I'm more than happy to be on the panel to represent Hinduism. And I'm also happy to help fill out the panel with other people through my network. And so I said, what do you have already? She goes, oh, we have a very diverse panel. We've got a Baptist, a Methodist, an Episcopalian, and a non-denominational Christian. They're all there. So what else do we need?
There you go. There's diversity and there's diversity.
Yeah. And so I ended up calling a friend of mine who was a Jew, and I went there. And so we had a little bit more diversity than 4 different expressions of Christianity. So anyway, long story short, I'll say one other thing. I've spoken to some Hindus who were impatient. They didn't feel that they had a room at the table, and they just stopped. And I whenever I have a conversation with anybody like that, I go, don't. You just keep on knocking. Someday the door will open. And that is proved to be true. Yeah. And the interfaith crowd, people who are naturally drawn to anything interfaith, multi-faith, I think they appreciate having a completely different tradition outside of the Abrahamic tradition just share. And I will say this too. So I've spoken to a lot of churches, usually, the adult Sunday school that some of them have in between services.
Mhm.
I have organized a number of series where, let's say, over 6 weeks, 1 week you get a Jew, the next week you get a Buddhist, on down the line. And when it's Hindu, normally I'm the person who says that, who does that. And more than once after class, somebody will come up to me and go, well, don't tell the pastor, but I think I believe in reincarnation. I say nothing. My goal is not, as you know, Hinduism is not evangelical. I do nothing to sway them one way or the other. Like, if you do, well, that's fine. No problem. But none of those incidences has happened at a evangelical church, I will admit I've spoken rarely at a church that would label itself evangelical. Usually it's mainstream Christianity, like Methodists,
Right. Mainline.
Presbyterians,
Yeah. Yeah.
Episcopalian. So, but the people treat me very, very well, very well.
Good. I appreciate your honesty about and sharing that many Hindus don't feel, your average Hindu, I don't think your average Christian really feels prepared to do that. But you and I and our friend and colleague Darren Dirksen have had, we were having an ongoing series of private conversations with our interest in seeing more grassroots conversations take place.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you reached out to me a few years ago. I was at a conference of evangelicals on Islamophobia, and we were talking. One of the ways we combat that is to have more dialogues on a grassroots level. And you reached out to me at that time, and we've been having conversations. So if anyone is listening to this, who's a pastor or connected to a church, and you're interested in seeing some kind of dialogue take place, please reach out to me and to Fred, and we'll see if we can make this kind of thing happen, because
I would love,
it
yes,
needs to
love.
be more than just the talking heads and the so-called professionals that do it. So,
Yep, yep. Can I say one other thing?
sure, of course.
Okay. I do the temple tours, so I get calls from churches, and again, usually mainline Protestant churches, occasionally a Catholic church. I don't get a lot of calls from evangelical churches, but there is one church that calls me every year, and it is a non-denominational Bible church, and they want a tour. It's usually a group of about 12 people at the most. Always the same pastor who leads them. And the reason that they come in, the reason that they tour the temple, is that shortly after the temple tour, within a month or two, they're on their way to India. And they're on their way to India to do mission work. So the purpose of them being in our temple is to learn more about Hinduism so they can convert Hindus to Christianity. I want you to know that I welcome them with as much love and understanding as anybody else that goes through the temple. My goal is to share knowledge. What you do with that knowledge is completely up to you. Sadly, we weren't able to do it this year because of COVID, but normally, actually, it's usually around the winter time. Yeah, because if you're going to go to India, you want to go in the winter most of the time, unless you're scaling the Himalayas. So I wanted to share that. It's kind of interesting. I would imagine that there are, I could find plenty of co-religionists of mine who go, why would you do that? But okay, do I want them to learn about Hinduism from a trusted source, or do I want them to learn from, some book written by a non-Hindu who refers to us as demon worshipers?
Right, right. Yeah, good point. Well, Fred, we are at the conclusion of your time. I appreciate you carving out some time. It's taken us a while to do it, but I've been privileged to be a guest on your radio show a couple of times, so I'm pleased to repay the favor here. Thanks for coming by. I appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. Namaste.
This is the podcast from Multi-Faith Matters. Again, please check out our website at multifaithmatters.org for additional resources. And please keep in mind, we are a nonprofit organization. We're only able to do this podcast and create additional resources due to the financial support of people who believe this is an important thing that needs to be done. We have a patrons page connected to the podcast. You can click up above on the website. And again, we thank you for listening or watching, and we look forward to you coming by the Multi-Faith Matters podcast again in the near future. Thanks so much.